In a peaceful neighborhood where laughter and innocence fill the air, darkness often lurks where it's least expected. Tim, a bright young boy with a love for basketball, shares a sunny afternoon with his best friend Josh, unaware that their lives are about to be shattered by a cruel act of prejudice. When a malicious woman decides to frame Tim for a crime he didn't commit, the stakes skyrocket, leading to a confrontation that shocks everyone involved. As the truth unravels, what follows is a heart-wrenching yet uplifting journey of justice, resilience, and the power of a mother's unwavering love. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. On that sweltering afternoon, the sun blazed mercilessly down on Cedarwood Park, casting long shadows as Tim and Josh, two boys on the brink of adolescence, engaged in a lively game of basketball. Tim, with his wiry frame and effortless agility, danced around the court, while Josh, shorter but solidly built, mirrored his friend's moves with stubborn tenacity. "Three-pointer, coming up," Tim exclaimed, launching the ball with a confident flick. It soared through the air, cutting a perfect arc before slipping cleanly through the net. Josh rolled his eyes with mock exasperation. "You're such a show-off. Just wait till I hit my growth spurt. Then you're in trouble." Their laughter rang out, filling the park with the kind of carefree joy only children know. But as their voices echoed across the playground, a shadow stirred behind the lace curtains of a nearby house. Beatrice Matthews, a woman in her 50s, with a stern face etched by years of disdain, watched the boys with a cold, calculating gaze. The sound of their laughter grated on her nerves, feeding into her deep-seated resentment. "Those boys think they own this neighborhood," she muttered bitterly, her eyes narrowing. "Someone needs to teach them a lesson." As the minutes ticked by, Beatrice's irritation festered into something far darker. Her pacing grew more frantic as she stole glances out of the window, her mind racing with malevolent thoughts. Finally, her gaze settled on an idea so sinister it made her pulse quicken. She hurried to her desk and retrieved a small bag of white powder she had hidden away, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and determination. For a moment she hesitated, questioning the enormity of what she was about to do. But her anger quickly drowned out any last vestige of conscience. With a steely resolve, Beatrice slipped out the back door, moving with quiet urgency toward the park. Tim and Josh, oblivious to her presence, continued their conversation near the basketball court. Beatrice's heart pounded as she approached Tim's backpack, abandoned on a bench. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, she unzipped the bag and dropped the drugs inside before hurrying back to her house, her chest tight with a perverse sense of satisfaction. Once inside, Beatrice wasted no time. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice calm and collected as she fabricated a story. "Hello, operator. I'd like to report some suspicious activity at Cedarwood Park. It looked like a drug deal to me." Meanwhile, Tim and Josh were wrapping up their day, completely unaware of the storm about to engulf them. "Catch you at school tomorrow?" Josh asked, grinning. "Definitely. Maybe by then, you'll learn how to make a proper three-pointer," Tim teased, slinging his backpack over his shoulder with a playful shove. As Josh jogged away, still laughing, Tim began his walk home, blissfully unaware of the danger closing in on him. The sound of distant sirens soon broke through the tranquil afternoon, growing louder with each passing second. Tim barely had time to process what was happening before two police cars screeched to a halt at the park entrance, their lights flashing ominously. "Young man, stop right there and put your hands where we can see them," barked one of the officers as they approached, their expressions grim and unyielding. Tim's heart leaped into his throat. Confusion and fear gripped him as he did as he was told. "What's going on?" "I haven't done anything wrong," he stammered, his voice trembling. Ignoring his protests, the officer reached for Tim's backpack, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. With cold efficiency, He unzipped the bag and pulled out the small bag of white powder. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Tim stared in horror. "What is this?" the officer demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "I don't know. That's not mine." I swear Tim's pleas were desperate, but they fell on deaf ears as the officers read him his rights. His life, once filled with the innocent joy of childhood, was now unraveling in the blink of an eye. Across the street, Beatrice watched the scene unfold from her window, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. To her, justice had been served. But as the officers led Tim away, Renee Johnson, a compassionate high school teacher, received a call that would change everything. As she answered the unfamiliar number, an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. Little did she know, the truth was about to come to light, and when it did, it would shock everyone to their core. "Miss Johnson, this is Officer Parker from the Cedarwood Police Department. We have your son, Tim, in custody." The words struck Renee like a physical blow. Her hand tightened around the edge of her desk, the familiar surroundings of her classroom suddenly feeling distant and surreal. The steady beat of her heart pounded in her ears as she struggled to make sense of what she had just heard. "There has to be some mistake," Renee managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tim's only a child." Officer Parker's tone remained flat, devoid of any comfort. "Ma'am, we found drugs in his possession. We need you to come down to the station immediately." Drugs? Her Tim? The words seemed to echo endlessly in her mind, each repetition more impossible than the last. Renee knew her son, knew his heart and his spirit. This was beyond unthinkable. It was a nightmare made real. "I'll be there right away," she said. The words automatic, even as her hands trembled with the weight of what was happening. She ended the call and fumbled to gather her belongings, her thoughts a chaotic whirl of disbelief and fear. Memories flooded her as she left the empty classroom behind the day Tim was born, so small and vulnerable in her arms, the sleepless nights when she had cradled him with one hand while grading papers with the other, the endless struggle of balancing motherhood and her teaching career. She had done it all for him, to give him the best life she could, to protect him from a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. As she drove to the police station, the past rushed at her like a torrent, the sidelong glances from other parents when they saw she was raising Tim alone. The day he came home in tears after being called a racial slur at school, the painful talk she'd had to have with him about staying safe, about how to act around the police, talks that no mother should ever have to give. Through all the trials, Tim had remained her beacon of hope, a boy who was kind, intelligent, and responsible. The idea that he could be caught up in something as dangerous as drugs was beyond comprehension. It was a cruel joke with life-altering stakes. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she thought of all the moments that had shaped him into the person he was, his love for basketball, his commitment to his schoolwork, and the close friendship he shared with Josh. None of it matched the picture being painted now, of a boy involved in something so dark and destructive. As the police station loomed ahead, Renee felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. She knew all too well how the system could be skewed against boys like Tim, and how quickly assumptions could lead to injustice. But she also knew that she had raised Tim to be strong, to stand up for himself, and to never back down from the truth. Stepping into the station, Renee straightened her shoulders, her teacher's resolve coming to the forefront. She would not let fear or despair show. She approached the front desk, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm Renee Johnson. I'm here to see my son, Tim." The officer at the desk directed her to a waiting area, where Renee began to pace, her thoughts racing with worry. What would the other parents think when they heard about this? Would they stand by her and Tim, or would they judge and distance themselves? And what about her colleagues? How would this affect her position at the school? But those concerns quickly faded in the face of what mattered. Tim was all that mattered now, Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before an officer finally came to lead her to an interrogation room. When the door opened and Renee saw Tim sitting there, the air left her lungs in a rush. Her son, her strong and vibrant boy, looked so small and broken, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes filled with fear and confusion. "Mom," the word burst from Tim, his voice cracking with emotion. Renee didn't hesitate. She crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled him into a fierce hug, feeling his body shake with suppressed sobs. Her heart ached with a pain so deep it left her breathless. This was her worst fear realized, a horror no mother should ever have to endure. But she knew, in that moment, that no matter what lay ahead, she would fight for Tim with everything she had. She would not let the system take him down, and she would not let him lose hope. Together, they would get through this. They had to. "It's okay, baby," Renee whispered, her fingers gently running through Tim's hair in a soothing rhythm. "We're going to figure this out, I promise." As she pulled back slightly, Renee met Tim's gaze. His eyes were rimmed with redness, filled with fear and confusion, but they were clear, innocent, untainted by guilt. It was at that moment that she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that her son was telling the truth. "Tim," she said, her voice steady and resolute, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Don't leave anything out." Tim's voice trembled as he recounted the events that led up to his arrest, his words spilling out in a mix of anxiety and frustration. Renee listened intently, her heart breaking with each detail. When he finally finished, she squeezed his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I believe you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her unwavering faith in him. "And I promise you, we're going to fight this. We're going to uncover the truth, no matter how hard it gets." A fierce determination surged within Renee as she looked at her son's face, a determination that burned away the fear and replaced it with a fiery resolve. This wasn't just about clearing Tim's name anymore, it was about challenging a system that too often cast its net unfairly over young black boys, ensnaring them in a web of falsehoods and prejudice. It was about standing up for justice in a world that seemed intent on denying it. When an officer entered the room to discuss Tim's case, Renee straightened her back, her eyes hardening with resolve. She was ready for the battle ahead, fully aware that it would be an uphill fight. But she was prepared to do whatever it took to protect her son and bring the truth to light. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, difficult conversations with school administrators, and nights that stretched into dawn, sleepless and filled with worry. But as the initial shock began to fade, Renee's instincts as a mother and a fighter kicked in. She knew that to clear Tim's name, she needed to dig deeper, to unravel the threads of this nightmare and expose the truth. Renee started by reaching out to the neighbors whose homes bordered Cedarwood Park. Most were sympathetic, expressing disbelief that Tim could be involved in anything illegal. But it was her conversation with Mrs. Lopez, an elderly woman who lived across from the park, that provided the first crucial lead. "I've seen that Beatrice Matthews watching the kids in the park," Mrs. Lopez confided, her voice low and cautious. "She's always scowling, always looking for trouble. And this isn't the first time she's caused problems." Renee's curiosity was piqued. She pressed Mrs. Lopez for more information and learned that Beatrice had a long history of making complaints about the neighborhood kids, particularly those who weren't white. She had called the police for noise disturbances, accused teens of vandalism, and even campaigned to have the basketball court removed, claiming it attracted the wrong crowd. With this new information in hand, Renee dug deeper, reaching out to other parents in the community, especially those whose children had been on the receiving end of Beatrice's baseless accusations. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Marcus, a 14-year-old boy, had been falsely accused of stealing from Beatrice's garden. Sarah, a 16-year-old girl, had been reported for suspicious behavior simply for walking her dog. In each case, the accusations were groundless. but the impact on the children's reputations and self-worth was real and damaging. As Renee pieced together these stories, her anger grew, fueled by a deep sense of injustice. It was clear that Beatrice's actions weren't just isolated incidents, they were part of a larger problem, one rooted in racism and a blatant abuse of power. Determined to take action, Renee organized a meeting with other concerned parents at the local community center. She was surprised by the large turnout. The small room was packed with parents who, like her, were fed up with the way their children were being treated. "We're here because our children are being unfairly targeted," Renee began, her voice carrying the authority of a teacher who had spent years advocating for her students. "And it's time we stand up and do something about it." For the next 2 hours, the parents shared their experiences. There were tears of frustration, voices raised in anger, and a collective sense of urgency to bring about change. By the end of the meeting, they had formed a support group and begun laying the groundwork for their next steps. Renee's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received an anonymous email one evening. The sender claimed to have information about Beatrice's connections within the local police department. Suspicious but intrigued, Renee agreed to meet the informant at a nearby coffee shop. The informant turned out to be a young police officer named David, who looked nervous as he approached Renee. After a brief introduction, he revealed that certain officers in the department had a reputation for responding swiftly to Beatrice's complaints, often without proper investigation. "It's not right," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she's got friends in high places. Nobody wants to question her." This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the situation. It wasn't just about one woman's prejudice anymore, it was about a system that protected and perpetuated such behavior. With this new information, Renee intensified her efforts. She documented every detail, every interaction, and every piece of evidence. She reached out to local civil rights organizations, sharing her findings and seeking their guidance. The fight for Tim's innocence had become a fight for justice, not just for him, but for all the children who had been wronged. One evening, as Renee was deep in her notes, Tim knocked on her door. His voice was hesitant as he spoke. "Mom," he said, stepping into the room, "I want to help. This isn't just about me anymore, is it?" Renee looked up at her son, her heart swelling with pride. She saw not just the child she had raised, but a young man who was ready to take a stand, ready to fight for what was right. She nodded, a mix of pride and sorrow in her eyes. This was not a battle she ever wanted him to face, but she knew that together they were stronger. And so mother and son stood united, ready to take on a system that had tried to break them. They would not back down, they would not be silenced, and they would not stop until the truth was revealed. "You're right," Renee said, her voice filled with determination. "This is bigger than us now. But we're going to face it together, and we're going to make a difference." As mother and son sat together, the weight of the situation seemed to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with challenges, but Renee was ready to fight not just for Tim, but for all the children who had been unfairly targeted, and for the future of their community. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and she would not stop until justice was served. The investigation was far from over, but with each day that passed, Renee edged closer to exposing the web of prejudice and corruption that had ensnared her son. She felt the pressure mounting, but she was resolute she would not back down. While Renee was deep in her investigation, Tim struggled under the weight of the accusations that had upended his life. The once familiar halls of his middle school had become a minefield of judgmental stares and hushed whispers. Yet through it all, one friend remained by his side, Josh. Their bond, forged on the basketball court, was now tested in ways neither of them had ever imagined. One afternoon, as they sat in Tim's room, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts, Josh finally spoke up. "This whole thing is messed up," Josh said, his frustration evident in his voice. "We both know you didn't do it. We can't just sit around and let this happen." Tim looked up, feeling a spark of hope. "You're right. We can't just wait for the adults to fix this. We need to take matters into our own hands and prove my innocence." With that shared resolve, the boys spent the next few hours brainstorming. Their ideas ranged from practical to wildly imaginative, but one plan stood out: they would conduct their surveillance on Beatrice, hoping to catch her in the act of framing someone else. The very next day after school, Tim and Josh set their plan into motion. Clad in dark clothes and armed with Josh's dad's old binoculars, they transformed the treehouse in Tim's backyard into their observation post. From there, they had a perfect view of Beatrice's house. "This feels like we're in one of those spy movies," Josh whispered, trying to suppress a grin as he peered through the binoculars. Tim, however, was all business. "Yeah, except this is real life. The stakes are too high to mess this up." The hours ticked by slowly as they watched Beatrice go about her daily routine, watering her plants, checking her mail, and occasionally watching TV. For a while, it seemed like their plan would amount to nothing. But just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, something unusual happened. A police car pulled up in front of Beatrice's house, and a uniformed officer, one they had never seen before, got out and walked up to her door. "Do you see that?" Tim whispered urgently, grabbing the binoculars from Josh. They watched with bated breath as Beatrice and the officer exchanged words. Although they couldn't hear what was being said, their tense body language spoke volumes. The conversation was heated, with Beatrice gesturing angrily, while the officer seemed to try to calm her down. Whatever was happening, it was clear that this wasn't just a casual visit. Josh's heart raced as he realized they might be on the verge of discovering something big. "This could be it, Tim. We might be onto something." Tim's mind raced with possibilities. He knew they couldn't jump to conclusions, but he also knew that this encounter could be the key to proving his innocence. If they could find out what Beatrice and the officer were discussing, they might uncover the truth behind the accusations against him. "We need to keep watching her," Tim said, determination hardening his voice. "If she's up to something, we'll catch her in the act. And when we do, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth." As they continued their surveillance, the boys felt a newfound sense of purpose. They were no longer just reacting to what had happened to Tim, they were actively taking steps to clear his name. It was risky, and they knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they had to try. For Tim, for his family, and for everyone else who had been wronged by Beatrice's lies, they had to uncover the truth. Renee's nerves were on edge as she sat in the waiting room of the law office, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The last few weeks had been a relentless storm of emotions and activity, and now, at last, there was a glimmer of hope. She had managed to secure a meeting with Dr. Rachel Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on the toughest cases and winning. When the office door finally opened, Renee stood up quickly, her heart racing. Dr. Carter stepped into the room, her presence commanding yet calm. The lawyer's dark skin radiated strength and resilience, and her crisp white suit only enhanced the sense of professionalism and power she exuded. "Mrs. Johnson, it's a pleasure to meet you," Dr. Carter said, extending her hand with a warm, reassuring smile. "The pleasure is mine," Renee replied, shaking her hand firmly, though she felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Thank you so much for seeing me." "Of course," Dr. Carter said, gesturing for Renee to sit. "I've reviewed the basics of your son's case, and I'm very interested in hearing more. Please tell me everything." Renee took a deep breath and began to recount the harrowing ordeal that had turned her and Tim's lives upside down. She told Dr. Carter about the false accusations, the investigation she had undertaken, and the shocking discoveries Tim and his friend Josh had made about Beatrice and her neighborhood watch group. As Renee spoke, Dr. Carter listened intently, her expression thoughtful and focused, occasionally jotting down notes. When Renee finished, Dr. Carter leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she considered the situation. "This is deeply concerning, Mrs. Johnson," she said after a moment. "What you're describing goes beyond just a case of mistaken identity or a neighbor with a grudge. This is a systematic effort to target and harass certain families in your community, and it's being done with the implicit support of local law enforcement." Renee nodded, feeling a surge of relief that Dr. Carter understood the gravity of the situation. "Exactly. And now, with everything Tim and Josh have uncovered, I'm more determined than ever to expose what's going on." Dr. Carter smiled, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "You and your son have done an incredible job gathering evidence. This isn't just a defense case anymore. This is about challenging an entire system of corruption and prejudice. I'm going to take this on, Mrs. Johnson, and together, we're going to make sure justice is served." A wave of gratitude washed over Renee, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I just want to protect my son and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Dr. Carter nodded firmly. "We will, Renee. But it's going to take time and a lot of hard work. Are you and Tim ready for that?" Renee straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "We're ready. Whatever it takes, we'll see this through." As they discussed the next steps, Renee felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Dr. Carter's confidence was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that they could win this fight. They had the evidence, they had the will, and now they had the legal expertise needed to bring the truth to light. Meanwhile, Tim and Josh continued to work on their side of the investigation, reaching out to more kids and collecting even more testimonies. The boys had transformed from scared children into determined advocates, driven by a shared commitment to justice. Every story they gathered, every piece of evidence they documented, was another step toward clearing Tim's name and dismantling the toxic culture of fear and prejudice that had taken root in their community. The journey ahead would be long and grueling, filled with legal battles, public scrutiny, and personal challenges. But with Renee, Tim, and Dr. Carter leading the charge, they were ready to face it all. The truth was on their side, and they were determined to shine a light on the darkness that had been allowed to fester for far too long. As Renee left the law office that day, she felt lighter and stronger. The fight for justice was just beginning, but she knew she wasn't alone. With her son by her side, a skilled attorney in their corner, and a community starting to rally behind them, they were ready to take on whatever obstacles lay ahead. Dr. Carter extended a warm hand toward Renee as she welcomed her into the office. "Miss Johnson," she said kindly, "please, have a seat." Once they were seated, Renee didn't waste a moment. She launched into a detailed account of Tim's situation, presenting the evidence she and the boys had painstakingly collected. Dr. Carter listened with unwavering attention, her face gradually reflecting the gravity of the situation with each new piece of information. When Renee finally finished, Dr. Carter took a deep breath, her expression now one of solemn determination. "Miss Johnson," she began, her voice firm but compassionate, "this case is undoubtedly complex. However, I see a strong foundation here, something we can build on. I am more than willing to take on Tim's defense." A wave of relief crashed over Renee, nearly overwhelming her. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." Dr. Carter's eyes softened, a hint of nostalgia touching her gaze. "I think I do understand," she said quietly. "When I was around Tim's age, I found myself in a similar situation. I was wrongly accused of vandalism by a neighbor, and it was my first encounter with the brutal injustice of the system. That experience is what drove me to pursue a career in law." Renee hung on every word as Dr. Carter recounted her past struggles. The lawyer spoke of the many hurdles she had faced as a young black woman in a field dominated by those who doubted her abilities. She shared stories of the times she had been dismissed, belittled, and overlooked, yet, through sheer determination, she had refused to back down. It wasn't an easy path, Dr. Carter admitted, her voice tinged with the weight of past battles. There were moments when I was tempted to give up, but I knew that every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward dismantling a system built on injustice. That belief, that hope for a better world, is what kept me going. As Dr. Carter spoke, Renee felt an unexpected connection growing between them. This wasn't just a lawyer speaking, this was a woman who understood the deep personal toll of fighting against a system designed to crush the vulnerable. Renee felt a newfound sense of hope here with someone who truly grasped the stakes, not just legally, but emotionally. Dr. Carter's demeanor shifted as she leaned forward, her tone turning sharp and focused. Now, let's talk strategy. The evidence you've gathered is crucial, but we must be tactical in how we deploy it. We can't afford to reveal our hand too soon. For the next hour, they meticulously mapped out their plan. Dr. Carter walked Renee through the legal labyrinth they would need to navigate, highlighting potential traps and emphasizing the importance of rallying community support. This was more than just a fight for Tim's innocence, it was a battle against a deeply entrenched system. Dr. Carter made it clear that they would face resistance, not just from those directly involved, but from the powerful forces invested in maintaining the status quo. As they worked, Renee felt a potent mix of anxiety and resolve. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, but with Dr. Carter leading the charge, there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps against all odds, they could win this fight. Near the end of their meeting, Dr. Carter paused, her eyes searching Renee's. "Miss Johnson," she said with quiet intensity, "I want you to know that this journey won't be easy. There will be times when it feels like we're fighting a losing battle. But I promise you, I'm in this for the long haul. We will see this through, no matter what." Renee nodded, a lump forming in her throat as she struggled to find the words. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," she managed to say, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Your dedication, it means the world to us." As they stood to leave, Dr. Carter gently placed a reassuring hand on Renee's shoulder, sealing a bond of trust that would carry them through the trials to come. Dr. Carter paused as Renee was about to leave. "One more thing, Miss Johnson," she said, her voice laced with quiet strength. "Tell Tim to keep his head up. He needs to remember that he's not alone in this battle, and neither are you." As Renee walked out of the office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. With Dr. Carter's unwavering support and her steadfast resolve, she was ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The road would be arduous, but together they could make it through. Driving home, Renee's thoughts swirled with everything they had discussed. The legal strategy, the evidence they still needed, the witnesses they had to prepare. Each detail played over in her mind like a puzzle she was determined to solve. But as she reflected, her thoughts turned to the broader impact of their fight. This wasn't just about Tim's innocence anymore. It was about confronting a system that had failed too many for too long. It was about fighting for every child who had been unjustly accused, every family that had been torn apart by discrimination, and every community that had been marginalized and silenced. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Renee felt a deep sense of resolve. She knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but with Dr. Carter's expertise guiding them and the truth on their side, they had a real shot at justice. Tomorrow, she would sit down with Tim and explain everything they needed to do. Together, they would face this challenge head-on, determined to see it through, not just for themselves, but for the countless others who were counting on them to make a difference. Meanwhile, as the investigation deepened, Tim and Josh's determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. Their amateur sleuthing had already unearthed some valuable clues, but they knew they needed something more concrete to bolster their case. One afternoon, from their hidden perch in the treehouse, they watched as a strange car pulled into Beatrice's driveway. A man in a police uniform stepped out, but something about him seemed off. His demeanor, the way he moved, and even his uniform didn't seem quite right. "That's not a real cop," Josh murmured, peering through the binoculars. "His badge, it's different from the ones we've seen before." Tim's pulse quickened as the implications hit him. "We need to get closer," he whispered, the urgency in his voice undeniable. They carefully climbed down from the treehouse and made their way to Beatrice's backyard, sticking to the shadows to remain unseen. As they neared the house, the muffled sound of voices reached their ears through an open window. The neighborhood watch meeting was a success. Beatrice's voice drifted out, cold and calculating. "We've identified several more undesirable elements in the area." "Good work," the man replied. "But we need to keep this under wraps. If word gets out about what we're doing, it could ruin everything." Tim and Josh exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. This was bigger than they had ever imagined. It wasn't just about Beatrice's prejudice, it was an organized effort to discriminate against and control their entire community. "We have to record this," Tim urged in a low voice, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Josh nodded, quickly pulling out his phone and starting the voice recorder. They stayed hidden, barely breathing, as they captured the conversation that would serve as damning evidence against the group. Just as they prepared to slip away, they heard Beatrice mention a name that sent a chill down their spines. "And what about the Johnson boy?" That was a close call. Beatrice's voice sliced through the air, laced with tension. "Don't worry," the man responded with chilling confidence. "I've got friends in the department. We'll make sure the charges stick." Tim's breath caught in his throat, and before he could stop himself, a gasp escaped his lips. The world seemed to freeze in that instant. Inside the house, Beatrice's voice sharpened with suspicion. "Did you hear that?" Panic surged through Tim and Josh like a lightning bolt. Without a second thought, they bolted, their feet pounding the pavement as they raced through the neighborhood, driven by pure fear. They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, finally collapsing in a nearby park, breathless and trembling. The weight of what they had just overheard crashed down on them, leaving them shaken to their core. Josh, still struggling to catch his breath, looked at Tim with wide eyes. "We've got to tell your mom," he stammered. "And Dr. Carter, this is huge." Tim nodded, his mind reeling. "Yeah, but we have to be careful. If they find out, we know he didn't need to finish the sentence." The danger was clear. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. They had stumbled upon something far more sinister, a conspiracy rooted in prejudice, corruption, and greed, aimed at controlling their entire community. In the days that followed, Tim and Josh worked meticulously, their youthful determination driving them forward. They organized the recordings, detailed everything they could remember, and even managed to covertly capture a few photos of Beatrice meeting with other members of the group. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged, knowing that one wrong move could tip their hand too soon. When they finally presented their findings to Renee and Dr. Carter, the room fell into a stunned silence. Dr. Carter's eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence, her usual composure giving way to a look of disbelief. "This is remarkable," Dr. Carter murmured, sifting through the documents and photos. "But it's also incredibly dangerous. You boys have uncovered something much bigger than we anticipated." Renee pulled Tim into a tight, protective embrace, her voice thick with both pride and fear. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice quivering, "but I'm also terrified. We have to be extremely cautious from here on out." Dr. Carter nodded gravely. "This changes everything. We're not just fighting a false accusation anymore, we're up against a deeply entrenched and corrupt system. Exposing this won't be easy." As they discussed the next steps, Tim's emotions churned inside him: fear, pride, and a burning determination. The gravity of their situation weighed heavily on him, but so did the resolve to see it through. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt. He looked from his mother to Dr. Carter, seeking guidance. Dr. Carter's expression was firm and resolute. "Now, we prepare for a battle like no other. This will be tough, and it will take time. But with this evidence, we have a real shot not just at clearing your name, Tim, but at dismantling the entire system that's been hurting people like you for far too long." As the meeting drew to a close, Tim realized that their lives had irrevocably changed. They were no longer just victims trapped in the gears of an unjust system. They had become warriors at the forefront of a fight to bring it crashing down. The stakes were higher than they had ever imagined, but looking at Josh, his mom, and Dr. Carter, Tim felt an unexpected surge of courage. They had the truth on their side, and together, they were ready to confront whatever obstacles lay ahead in their quest for justice. The morning of the trial arrived, shrouded in a heavy, tense atmosphere that seemed to blanket all of Cedarwood. The courthouse steps were teeming with people, reporters eager for a story, curious townsfolk, and supporters from both sides of the case. Renee and Tim made their way up the steps early, flanked by Dr. Carter, their faces a blend of determination and quiet anxiety. As they ascended, Tim caught sight of Josh in the throng, who flashed him a thumbs up. The sight of his friend lifted Tim's spirits. They had prepared tirelessly for this day, and now it was time to reveal the truth to the world. Inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. The air crackled with anticipation as the trial began. The prosecutor, Mr. Barnes, a stern-faced man with a reputation for being relentless, sat at his table with an air of confidence, shuffling his papers as if victory was already his. Across from him, Dr. Carter calmly arranged her notes, her composed demeanor in stark contrast to the nervous energy that seemed to fill the room. As the bailiff called the court to order, Tim's heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the crowded gallery, recognizing familiar faces: neighbors, teachers, classmates. But there were also strangers, people who had heard of the case and come to show their support. The sight was both comforting and overwhelming. The judge, a formidable silver-haired woman named Judge Elaine Morgan, entered the courtroom with a commanding presence. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and the room fell silent. Once everyone was seated, Judge Morgan addressed the court with a tone of measured authority. "We are here today in the case of the state versus Tim Johnson. Mr. Barnes, you may proceed with your opening statement." Mr. Barnes rose from his seat, his voice steady and forceful as he laid out his narrative. He depicted Tim as a troubled teen ensnared in a web of bad choices, caught red-handed with illegal substances. He spoke about the importance of protecting the community and the need to take a stand against drug use among minors. As Tim listened, a mixture of anger and disbelief welled up inside him. The portrait Mr. Barnes painted of him was a grotesque distortion, a character he didn't recognize. He turned to his mother, who offered him a reassuring squeeze of his hand, grounding him in the truth. When Dr. Carter stood to deliver her opening statement, she did so with deliberate grace, her presence commanding every eye in the room. "Your Honor, members of the jury." She began, her voice ringing clear and resolute. "What you've just heard is nothing more than a carefully constructed story, a fabrication rooted in bias and false assumptions. Today, we will not only prove Tim Johnson's innocence, but also shine a light on a disturbing pattern of discrimination and corruption that has plagued our community." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom at her words. Judge Morgan quickly called for order, her gavel striking down the whispers. Dr. Carter continued, outlining the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, hinting at the broader conspiracy they intended to expose. As she spoke, Tim noticed the jurors leaning forward, their initial skepticism giving way to curiosity and concern. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Parker, the officer who had arrested Tim. Mr. Barnes questioned him with precision, and Officer Parker dutifully recounted the day he allegedly found drugs in Tim's backpack. His testimony was confident, his tone unwavering, and for a moment, it felt as if the walls were closing in on Tim. But when Dr. Carter rose for cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. Dr. Carter's questions were sharp and unyielding, gradually peeling back the layers of Officer Parker's story. She probed the circumstances surrounding the arrest, highlighting the unusually swift response to the 911 call and the glaring absence of proper search protocols. She then turned her focus to the officer's connection with Beatrice Matthews, the neighbor who had made the call. "Officer Parker," Dr. Carter said, her voice cutting through the silence, "isn't it true that you have responded to numerous calls from Miss Matthews in the past, often without proper verification of the situation?" Officer Parker shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I'm not sure. We respond to a lot of calls," he stammered. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Dr. Carter replied, producing a stack of documents. "In the past year alone, you've responded to 27 calls from Miss Matthews, more than 3 times the average for any other resident in Cedarwood. Can you explain this discrepancy?" A tense silence filled the courtroom as Officer Parker struggled to respond. Tim could see the jurors exchanging glances, their expressions growing increasingly skeptical. The momentum was shifting. The rest of the day unfolded similarly, with the prosecution calling more witnesses, each of whom Dr. Carter deftly dismantled on cross-examination. She exposed inconsistencies, contradictions, and the underlying bias that tainted their testimony. And with each passing hour, the case against Tim seemed to weaken, while the broader implications of their fight became ever clearer. As the first day of the trial drew to a close, Judge Morgan addressed the court. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. The court is adjourned." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day, Tim felt a complex mix of emotions: exhaustion, fear, but also a burgeoning sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but today had shown that the truth had a chance to prevail. Surrounded by his mother, Dr. Carter, and the growing number of supporters in the courtroom, Tim knew that whatever lay ahead, they were ready to face it together. Mrs. Lopez, a petite woman with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Dr. Carter before answering. "Yes, I have," she said, her voice unwavering despite the tension in the room. A few years ago, she accused a young black man who was delivering groceries of trespassing. She claimed he was acting suspiciously, but it turned out he was just trying to find the correct address. I've seen her do similar things more than once, especially toward people who don't fit her idea of who belongs in the neighborhood. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom, and Tim felt a swell of vindication. Mrs. Lopez's testimony was the clearest indication yet that Beatrice Matthews had a pattern of racially motivated behavior, lending weight to their argument that Tim had been unfairly targeted. Mr. Barnes attempted to discredit Mrs. Lopez by questioning her memory and motives, but her responses were firm, consistent, and filled with quiet conviction. By the time she stepped down, it was clear that her words had made a significant impact on the jury. As the trial progressed, Dr. Carter introduced more evidence that painted a broader picture of the systemic issues at play. She called several other witnesses, including community members who testified to the racial bias they had observed from Beatrice and the local authorities. Each testimony reinforced the narrative that Tim's arrest was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of discrimination. The turning point came when Dr. Carter introduced the audio recording Tim and Josh had secretly captured of Beatrice and the fake officer discussing their plans to ensure the charges against Tim stuck. The courtroom was tense as the recording played, the damning words echoing through the room. Faces in the gallery shifted from shock to outrage as the depth of the conspiracy became undeniable. Mr. Barnes attempted to object, claiming the recording was inadmissible, but Judge Morgan ruled against him, allowing the jury to hear the full conversation. The impact was devastating for the prosecution. The once solid case against Tim was crumbling, exposed as a web of lies spun by those intent on upholding their prejudices. With the defense's case concluded, the trial neared its end. Dr. Carter delivered a powerful closing argument, reminding the jury that this trial was not just about clearing Tim's name, but about standing up against the deep-seated injustices that had plagued their community for far too long. As the jury deliberated, the courthouse was filled with a tense silence. Hours felt like days as everyone waited for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned and Judge Morgan called the court to order. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide Tim's fate. We find the defendant, Tim Johnson, not guilty on all charges. The words hung in the air for a moment before relief and joy swept through Tim, Renee, and everyone who had supported them. Tears streamed down Renee's face as she hugged her son tightly. Dr. Carter smiled, her calm composure giving way to a rare expression of satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters cheered, and reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Dr. Carter addressed the media with measured words, emphasizing the importance of the victory, not just for Tim, but for the entire community. As they walked away from the courthouse, Tim felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his mother, for Josh, for Dr. Carter, and for everyone who had believed in him. The battle had been long and hard, but they had won. They had proven that truth and justice could prevail, even against the odds. And as they looked ahead to the future, Tim knew that this was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done to heal and change their community, but now they had the strength, the courage, and the hope to do it. Together, they would continue the fight for justice, determined to build a world where no one else would have to endure what they had. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat, his usual confident demeanor now tempered with a hint of reluctance. "Your Honor," he began, choosing his words carefully, "the prosecution has received evidence that directly undermines the credibility of the arresting officer and the key witness, Ms. Beatrice Matthews. This evidence includes additional recordings, eyewitness testimony, and police records that suggest a pattern of misconduct and racial bias. It appears that there was a concerted effort to target Tim Johnson without just cause. Given this information, the state believes it cannot, in good faith, continue to pursue these charges." The shock in the courtroom was palpable. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had paused. Tim's heart pounded in his chest as he grasped the magnitude of what was happening. Beside him, Renee let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling up in her eyes. Dr. Carter remained composed, but a slight smile tugged at the corner of her lips, a sign of the vindication she had worked so tirelessly to achieve. Judge Morgan leaned forward, her expression stern but thoughtful. "Mr. Barnes, are you certain that this is the correct course of action? These are serious charges that were levied against this young man." "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Barnes replied, his voice steady but somber. "The state acknowledges that pursuing these charges would be an injustice. Therefore, we respectfully request that all charges against Tim Johnson be dismissed, and that this court consider investigating the broader implications of this case." A murmur spread through the courtroom as those present grappled with the sudden turn of events. Judge Morgan nodded slowly, then addressed the court with measured authority. "In light of the prosecution's request and the compelling nature of the new evidence presented, this court grants the motion to dismiss all charges against Tim Johnson. Furthermore, I will be recommending a formal inquiry into the actions of the individuals involved in this case, particularly regarding the allegations of misconduct and racial bias." As the judge's words sank in, the courtroom erupted into a mix of cheers, applause, and relieved sighs. Tim felt a rush of emotions: relief, joy, disbelief, as the weight of the charges that had hung over him for so long was finally lifted. Renee hugged him tightly, her tears of joy mingling with his own. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression one of quiet triumph. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the moment. Dr. Carter, flanked by Tim and Renee, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Today is a victory for truth and justice," she declared, her voice clear and resolute. "This case has revealed deep flaws in our system, flaws that must be addressed if we are to ensure that no other innocent person is subjected to what Tim Johnson has endured. We are grateful to the court for its fair and just decision, and we remain committed to pursuing the broader fight for equality and accountability." Tim, standing tall beside his mother and Dr. Carter, felt a profound sense of closure. The battle had been long and harrowing, but they had prevailed. As he looked out at the crowd, a mix of supporters, neighbors, and even those who had doubted him, he knew that this was more than just his victory. It was a victory for his community, for those who had been marginalized and silenced, and for the principles of justice that they had fought so hard to uphold. As they made their way through the throngs of people, Tim caught sight of Josh standing near the edge of the crowd. His friend smiled broadly, giving him another thumbs up, and this time, Tim felt no fear, no anxiety, only the deep, abiding satisfaction of knowing that they had done what was right. The truth had come to light, and justice had been served. And with that, a new chapter began, not just for Tim, but for everyone who had been touched by this case. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the work was far from over. But with the strength they had gained from this experience, Tim knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would continue to fight for a better, fairer world, confident in the knowledge that truth and justice would always prevail in the end. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his voice tense as he delivered the shocking news. "Your Honor, we have received a sworn statement from Officer David Martinez admitting to his involvement in a conspiracy with Beatrice Matthews and others to falsely accuse and frame individuals in the Cedarwood community, particularly targeting people of color." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Tim felt a wave of dizziness as relief, shock, and disbelief washed over him all at once. Dr. Carter's steady hand on his shoulder grounded him, reminding him that this nightmare was finally nearing its end. Judge Morgan's expression hardened as she absorbed the magnitude of the disclosure. Addressing the court, she spoke with stern authority. "In light of this development, I am dismissing all charges against Tim Johnson. Furthermore, I am recommending a full investigation into the Cedarwood Police Department and the activities of Ms. Matthews and her associates." Turning to Tim, she softened slightly. "Mr. Johnson, on behalf of the court, I extend our deepest apologies for the ordeal you have endured. You are free to go." As Tim stood, his legs shaky with the overwhelming relief, the courtroom erupted into cheers and applause. Renee immediately pulled him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face, both of them barely able to comprehend that the nightmare was finally over. But Judge Morgan wasn't finished yet. "However," she continued, her voice commanding the attention of everyone present, "the issues raised in this trial go far beyond one false accusation. They point to systemic problems of racism and corruption that cannot be ignored. I am ordering a comprehensive review of all cases handled by the officers implicated in this conspiracy." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, ensuring her words resonated deeply. "Let this case serve as a wake-up call. Justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but also about protecting the innocent and addressing the root causes of injustice in our society." As the judge concluded the proceedings, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, with a mix of triumph and resolve. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, supporters hugged one another, and Tim found himself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Dr. Carter, ever composed, shook hands with Tim and Renee, her eyes gleaming with pride and determination. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice firm. "We've opened the door, but there's still a lot of work to do to ensure real change happens. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered, chanting Tim's name and holding signs demanding justice and police reform. As Tim, his mother, and Dr. Carter emerged, a wave of cheers rose from the crowd. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the air buzzed with the energy of the moment. Dr. Carter stepped forward to address the media, her voice strong and clear. Today, justice has prevailed not just for Tim Johnson, but for every person who has ever been unfairly targeted or discriminated against. This case has exposed deep-rooted issues in our community, and we are committed to seeing through the changes needed to address them. Tim, overwhelmed by the support and attention, spotted Josh in the crowd. His best friend pushed through the throng to reach him, pulling Tim into a bear hug that was filled with the shared relief and triumph of their hard-fought battle. "We did it," man Josh said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." As the crowd's chants grew louder, Tim felt a surge of pride and purpose. The ordeal he had endured was finally over, but he realized now that this fight had become about more than just clearing his name. It was about standing up against the injustices that had plagued his community for far too long. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless, about challenging a system that had failed so many. It was about sparking the change that Cedarwood and communities like it desperately needed. Renee wrapped her arm around Tim's shoulders, her voice soft and full of love. "I'm so proud of you, Tim," she whispered. "You've shown incredible strength and courage through all of this." Tim looked out at the crowd, at the faces of those who had stood by him, at the signs demanding change, and at the reporters eager to share his story with the world. He knew now that his journey had become something much bigger than himself. As they made their way through the cheering crowd, Tim understood that while this chapter was closing, a new one was just beginning. The fight for justice and equality in Cedarwood and beyond was far from over. But today they had taken a significant step forward. Tim was ready to continue the journey, determined to use his voice and his experience to help create the change they all knew was necessary. The trial had concluded, but the impact of its revelations would resonate for years to come. For Tim, for Cedarwood, and for countless others who had faced similar injustices, this was not an end, but a powerful new beginning, one that promised hope, justice, and a future where truth would always prevail. In the days following the trial's dramatic conclusion, Cedarwood became a focal point of intense activity and reflection. The dismissal of charges against Tim and the exposure of corruption within the police department had ignited a firestorm of public outcry, demanding justice and systemic reform. Yet, just as the community began grappling with these revelations, an unexpected and pivotal development unfolded. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Renee received an urgent call from Dr. Carter. "Renee, you and Tim need to come to my office immediately. There's been a significant development." Unease settled over Renee as she and Tim hurried to meet with Dr. Carter. When they arrived, they found the lawyer pacing, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "What's going on?" Renee asked, her voice tinged with concern as they settled into their seats. Dr. Carter took a deep breath before delivering the news. "Beatrice Matthews has come forward. She wants to make a full confession." Tim and Renee exchanged stunned glances. This was the last thing they had expected. But that's not all. Dr. Carter continued, her tone growing more serious. "She's willing to provide evidence implicating several high-ranking officials in the police department and city council in a long-standing scheme of discrimination and corruption." The revelation hung in the air, leaving them momentarily speechless. Finally, Tim found his voice. "Why now? Why is she doing this?" Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "The trial exposed too much. Beatrice is facing significant legal consequences, and I believe she's hoping that by cooperating, she might receive some leniency." As they discussed the implications of Beatrice's confession, A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the office window, they could see a crowd gathering on the street. News vans pulled up, and reporters scrambled to set up their cameras. "It looks like the news is already spreading," Renee observed, her voice uneasy. Dr. Carter nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities and dangers. "We need to move quickly. Beatrice's testimony could blow this entire case wide open, but it also puts her at significant risk. If she follows through, we have to ensure her safety." Just then, a knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. To their surprise, it was Officer David Martinez, the same young officer whose statement had led to the dismissal of charges against Tim. His face was drawn with concern. "I'm sorry to intrude," Martinez began, his voice heavy with urgency, "but I overheard about Beatrice's confession. You need to know some people will do anything to keep her quiet." The gravity of the situation settled over them like a cold shadow. What had started as a false accusation against Tim had spiraled into the exposure of a vast network of corruption. Dr. Carter immediately sprang into action, making calls to trusted contacts in the FBI and the state attorney's office. "We need to move Beatrice to a safe location immediately," Dr. Carter directed, her voice sharp with resolve. "And we must secure her evidence and corroborate it before it can be discredited or destroyed." As plans were swiftly put into motion to protect Beatrice and her critical testimony, Tim felt a swirl of emotions. Anger still simmered toward Beatrice for her role in his ordeal, but he also recognized the courage it took for her to come forward now, when the stakes were so high. Outside, the crowd continued to swell, and the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. Word of Beatrice's impending confession had spread like wildfire, sparking demands for immediate arrests and a complete overhaul of Cedarwood's leadership. As night fell, Beatrice was safely moved into protective custody, and her evidence was handed over to federal investigators. The story had quickly gone national, with major news outlets covering the unfolding drama in Cedarwood, framing it as a pivotal moment in the fight against systemic injustice. Exhausted but unable to sleep, Tim found himself sitting on the front porch, watching as cars filled with reporters and curious onlookers slowly cruised by. Renee joined him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders in silent comfort. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern. Tim sighed, his thoughts heavy. "I'm not sure. It's all so overwhelming. I never imagined it would get this big." Renee nodded, understanding his turmoil. "I know, but you should be proud, Tim. Your strength, your perseverance, it's inspired people. You've become a symbol of what's possible when we stand up against injustice." As they sat together in the quiet night, Tim's phone buzzed with a message from Josh. "Dude, have you seen the news? Justice for Starwood is trending nationwide." A small smile tugged at Tim's lips. What had started as his struggle for justice had grown into a movement that was shaking the very foundations of power in Cedarwood and beyond. Beatrice's confession and the evidence she provided promised to expose the full extent of corruption, sparking a reckoning that would resonate far beyond their town. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Tim felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, with resistance from those who benefited from the old system. But looking out at the neighborhood he had always called home, Tim knew that real change was possible. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the opportunity for lasting reform. "Mom," he said, turning to Renee with newfound resolve, "I want to be part of making things better, not just for us, but for everyone in Cedarwood, for everyone who's ever faced injustice." Renee's eyes shone with pride as she smiled at her son. "You already are, honey. You already are." As the sun rose on a new day in Cedarwood, it brought with it a sense of hope, justice, and the promise of a better future. The final twist in Tim's story had opened the door to a new chapter, not just for him, but for an entire community ready to confront its past and build a more just and equitable future. And there you have it, the journey of Tim Johnson and the community of Cedarwood, a story that started with a fight for justice and grew into a movement for change. We've witnessed the power of truth, the importance of standing up against corruption, and the courage it takes to confront deep-seated injustice. So what have you learned from this story? What insights or lessons will you carry forward into your own life? We invite you to reflect and share one thing you've learned and plan to put into practice in the comments below this video. Your thoughts and actions can be the spark that inspires others to join the fight for justice and equality. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and encourage us to make a difference. Thank you for watching.